So as you can see, I am basically walking on the side of a highway here in Vaassen, the Netherlands. And that brings me directly into the first thing that Dutch people do much better than Americans, which is driving. So you can see I'm not alone on this highway. There are cars, there are bikes, there are motorcycles, other pedestrians, so on and so forth. This is not something I would ever even entertain the thought of back home in the US, walking on the side of a major road like this. I mean, this is not really, I guess it is kind of a small road, but you can tell the vehicles are not moving at pedestrian speeds. They're moving at vehicular speeds. And while I don't feel completely comfortable walking on the side of this road, again, I wouldn't even entertain the idea of doing this back home simply because of the quality of the drivers back home. The quality of the drivers back home would not allow for this kind of activity to happen. I guess some people are maybe a little more comfortable with it, but me personally, I am not one of those people, because I've heard far too many stories of pedestrians being hit where they were supposed to be. They were on the sidewalks, they were in the crosswalks with the right of way. You can see, again, I'm walking right here on this suggested bike lane, which in this particular area on this street doubles as a sidewalk. And again, while I'm not fully perfectly comfortable with this, I am comfortable enough to actually do it. And given that there are no other alternatives on this particular road, I guess I kind of have to be comfortable with it. But it seems like everyone else, for the most part, is pretty comfortable with this arrangement as well. Now, speaking of cyclists, I mentioned that there are cyclists on this road as well, which, by the way, is one of those roads that I've referred to in my other videos where basically you have two different directions of traffic traveling down what seems like a one-way street, which also would never have worked back home in the US, especially with cars driving at these speeds. Maybe in a small neighborhood where cars are going 20 kilometers an hour at most, but cars driving at basically highway speeds going in completely opposite directions, that simply wouldn't work back home. But on the topic of cyclists, the next thing the Dutch people do far better than Americans is cycle. Dutch people are much better at cycling than Americans, and this makes sense because Dutch people do it so much more frequently. But one culture shock that I haven't really mentioned in any of my other videos, surprisingly, is how so many people here seem to be completely comfortable cycling without having their handles on the handlebars, or their hands on the handlebars rather. And this was the kind of thing that growing up we would do as more of a novelty thing. It was no different than, let's say for example, doing a wheelie or other BMX tricks or things like that. But here it seems like a relatively normal skill to have, especially for younger people. I haven't really seen too many older people doing this, but I've definitely seen younger people who seemed completely comfortable with the idea of not only cycling without using their hands, but taking full-on turns. Full speed turns without using their hands. I never really saw that back home. I never really saw anybody ever take a turn on their bicycle without using their hands. But here, people just do it very confidently and comfortably. And again, this is probably just a function of cycling on a daily basis for years on end, but it's still impressive nonetheless. And not only that, but people here have much better cycling etiquette where they use the hand signals and things like that. It took me about 4 or 5 months to actually start using those hand signals, because I never learned those growing up. We don't learn how to use hand signals when we bike. We don't even have biking classes like they do here. And so aside from the tricks and the novelties of being able to cycle with no hands and things like that, just from a fundamental standpoint, Dutch people are much better at cycling. And honestly, it surprises me that Dutch people don't dominate the Tour de France and all of these other cycling events. Maybe they do. I don't really follow those events, but to my knowledge, I don't believe that's the case. But the same way that Dutch people dominate ice skating, I would definitely imagine that cycling would also be the predominant sport here. But of course, the predominant sport here is voetbal, or as Americans like to call it, soccer. But on the topic of cycling, all of the cycling that Dutch people do wouldn't really be feasible without bike lanes. And the bike lanes would not really exist without having competent urban planners and engineers in place. And that brings me to the next thing that Dutch people do much better than Americans, which is urban planning and engineering. Dutch urban planners and engineers, in my opinion, should be paid just as much as, oh my gosh, you know that smell when, I guess, they fertilize the fields and all of that with the fertilizer? I think maybe they use cow manure or whatever. That just hit me all at once. But anyways, I digress. I believe that Dutch urban planners and engineers should be paid just as much as Dutch doctors and lawyers. And I know that might be a controversial, contrarian statement to make, but the quality of the urban planning and the execution of the urban planning is unlike anything I've seen anywhere else, including other places in Europe. I've been to London, I've been to Zurich, I've been to Valencia, I've been to Antwerp, and so far, I would say the only city that compared from an urban planning standpoint was Valencia. Every other European city, and of course American cities, they're not even in the conversation. Every other city I've been to was well behind the Netherlands as far as the quality and consistency of the urban planning and just the overall density. Even in a small town like Vassen, where there's only 12,000 people, I know that in most of these videos that I film here, I'm showing scenery like this, and I'll explain why that is here in a few minutes. But even in small towns like this, I've noticed that in the more city center area, there's a lot more density. You still have mid-rise developments where you have the grocery stores and the other shops, the restaurants, bars, etc., with the apartments on top of them. And that's just not really something that you see back home in a town of this size. And so when I say consistency, what I mean is that the urban planning and engineering out here is thorough. It pervades every part of the country, at least every part of the country that I've personally been to. And even in instances where some of the infrastructure, like bike lanes, for example, isn't really present, again, the people make up for that difference. So you don't really need bike lanes in a city like this because there are only 12,000 people. There's never really any traffic. You have cars, but you don't have traffic. And because the drivers are more competent, the urban planners and engineers know that they don't have to allocate that effort and that money toward creating bike lanes where they're not really fully necessary. Now, you just heard me mention that I typically prefer to film videos in these sort of random locations with very few people, and that is for a reason. I like to get as far away from civilization as possible when I film my videos because, truthfully, For as often as I do this, I'm still not fully comfortable speaking to a camera in front of people. I'm still not fully comfortable speaking to a camera at all, but especially in front of people. I still struggle with, I would say, mild social anxiety. I still get nervous every time I pull this camera out to start filming, and I'm really getting out of my comfort zone to make these videos for you. That said, I will say that vlogging in the Netherlands is substantially easier than vlogging pretty much anywhere else that I've been, and that is because the next thing that Dutch people do better than Americans is they mind their business. I've noticed that Dutch people are really good at minding their business. And what I mean by this is, of course, when people see me talking to this camera, especially in a small town like this, they're curious. They're curious because a lot of them have probably never seen somebody do this before. But even if they're curious, even if they give me those little side glances and I can see them doing that, nobody ever interrupts my filming process, which I really, really appreciate because, again, as somebody who's already a nervous filmer, personally, I find it very difficult to regain my train of thought once I've lost it. And I've definitely had instances back home in the US where I would be filming a vlog like this and somebody would interject or interrupt my filming process. Whether it's because they wanted attention or just because, I don't know, they just feel like interrupting my video for whatever reason. It definitely made the process of filming videos much more difficult for me. And I just haven't really had to experience that here in the Netherlands because people mind their own business. I mean, when my girlfriend and I went to Antwerp, Belgium, we were there for all of 4 hours. And within the first 10 minutes of me pulling my camera out, there were these kids just obnoxiously screaming from the other side of the street, and then they crossed over to our side of the street to interrupt the video and all of that. And obviously I cut all of that out from the final video, but I mean, stuff like that really, really makes me not want to film. And so that's a big part of the reason why I've been able to bring you so much content out here in the Netherlands, is because people here just don't do stuff like that. And of course, I mean, maybe, I don't know, I might be jinxing it, maybe in the future that could happen, but so far that has not happened. Or if it has happened, I can think of one time that someone has quote-unquote interrupted my video. They did it in a way that was positive and encouraging. So maybe they would say hi, or they'd say welcome to such and such place. Maybe you saw that in one of my recent videos. That's the instance I'm referring to. And I don't know if this road leads to this house or if I can kind of go around the house. I guess we're gonna find out. But anyways, those instances are not really the same as people consciously and intentionally trying to uproot my filming process, which I guess maybe for a lot of people, they don't understand that this is literally my job. This is how I'm paying for this Airbnb, how I'm getting groceries for my girlfriend and I. And so they don't understand the gravity of what I'm doing. But I digress. I'm going on a whole tangent there that I don't really need to go on. The point that I'm making is that I don't really have to deal with those unwelcome interruptions when it comes to vlogging in the Netherlands, because Dutch people just mind their business. They mind their business. And another thing that Dutch people do much better than Americans is communicate. Dutch people communicate better than Americans. So in a recent video, I actually stated that I had yet to really see, and I think the path does go around their house, so I don't actually have to go on their property, which is nice. But anyways, I stated that I hadn't yet really seen Dutch directness for myself since I arrived in the Netherlands, and that I had found that stereotype to be largely false. Well, what I've realized since then was that I have seen Dutch directness from the time that I got here. It's just I didn't see it in real life. I saw it in YouTube comments. And basically what I mean by that is I've had a lot of people comment things that initially I thought, wow, that sounds a little bit abrasive. This person is maybe rough around the edges. And of course I'm referring to the comments that people would leave on videos like this. Videos which primarily attract Dutch people. Maybe like yourself, if you're Dutch watching this. And it took me a very long time to understand that this is simply Dutch directness at work. This is Dutch directness. It's people commenting exactly what they think and not sugarcoating it. And I think that this is actually a really good thing. This is actually a really, really good thing, because ultimately what this does is it saves time. It saves everyone time. They don't have to think about how they're going to deliver the message. I don't have to sit there and think about, there's a waterfall there for some reason. That's really interesting. Oh, it keeps going too. Yeah, that's really nice. But anyways, I don't really have to think about if I'm perceiving it wrong. No, the way that most Dutch people comment on my videos leaves no room for misinterpretation. And as somebody who doesn't like to waste time, as somebody who values my time dearly, that's nice. That is unequivocally a good thing. But that's not the only component of communication that Dutch people are very good at. You see, Dutch people are almost all at least bilingual. And the average American definitely only speaks and understands one language. Back home, if you were bilingual, especially if you were born and raised in the US, if you were bilingual, I mean, you were definitely the exception rather than the rule. That was not something that we were accustomed to seeing. And I don't know if this is a park or something over here. I'm gonna go ahead and check this out, see what this is all about, and take you with me, of course. Or maybe this is actually someone's house. I don't really know. This doesn't look like a house. This looks like maybe some kind of weekend getaway, cabin lodge or something like that. Yeah, I don't want to intrude on anyone's privacy, but anyways, the average Dutch person speaks fluent Dutch and understands Dutch, of course, because they're born and raised here. But also, the average Dutch person speaks and understands English exceptionally well. Even in this small town where people definitely don't know English quite as well as their bigger city counterparts, they know enough English to converse with me. I have yet to meet somebody who was unable to converse with me in English. And honestly, of course, this has made my experience much more seamless as far as integrating into the Netherlands. But on top of that, I would imagine that for the average Dutch person, this makes their life a lot easier as well, because they can go anywhere they want. And I think that this is a very important skill to have, is being able to speak multiple languages. Obviously, I was lucky, for lack of a better term, to be born in the US, where English is the predominant language, and that is kind of the predominant language in a lot of the world. And this definitely leads to someone's house, I think. We're gonna go ahead and see. But I was very fortunate in that regard, but a lot of people are not that fortunate. And they grow up in countries like the Netherlands, for example, where the language is only really spoken in that country or in a very small geographical area, but they don't learn English. So they're basically stuck in that area until they can learn English. And as I've come to realize, it is much more difficult to learn a new language as an adult than it is as a child. Much more difficult. So it's definitely a very big benefit, I believe, of growing up in the Netherlands, is that you get to learn English. Even if you're not completely fluent in it, you're conversational in it, which to me is fluency. But maybe you're not necessarily going to pass any English tests, but you can get your point across and you can understand people when they speak to you.